Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was the name Americans would shiver at during the 1970s. He was known for his charm and good looks, which he used to lure his victims, who were usually young college girls in Washington and Oregon, before brutally murdering them. Initially, Bundy was dismissed as a suspect since police thought it was very unlikely for a young law student to be hunting down at least one young girl every day. Bundy's psychopathy was chilling. He would often approach his victims wearing a cast or some other props that made him look disabled and ask for their help to carry some stuff to his car. From there, he would knock them out, drive away to a secret spot, and eventually, after a series of assaults, brutally murder them and dump their bodies. If that wasn't creepy enough, it was also found that Bundy would revisit his crime scenes to engage in acts of necrophilia with his victims' decomposing bodies. His intelligence and meticulous planning made him a master manipulator, able to escape custody multiple times and even live in a happy marriage for a few years. Bundy's deranged behavior reached its peak when he brutally attacked several women at Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house in a single night. Bundy was finally arrested and executed in 1989. At his final hearing, Bundy himself was heard saying, "I'm the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet." Jeffrey Dahmer. When talking about psychotic killers, how can one forget Jeffrey Dahmer, the infamous Milwaukee cannibal, America's top serial killer, and the man who alone killed 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. Dahmer's main victims were black gay men he would spot at bus stops, clubs, or malls. He would lure them into his apartment with promises of money or a cure for their loneliness. He would then heavily drug them and strangle them to death. But that wasn't the gruesome part. He would then proceed to molest the dead bodies and then dismember them, often keeping some of the body parts as souvenirs. It is also said that he would take pictures throughout the process so he could relive the moment later. Dahmer had a deep interest in animal bones and methods of preserving them from a young age. He even had a well-curated collection of the animal skulls and bones at his parents' home. Dahmer accepted to have a strong attraction toward males from a young age, which grew into a dark fantasy with his exposure to the outside world. Dahmer was arrested on the 2nd of July, 1991, when his soon-to-be victim was spotted wandering the neighborhood. Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, in 1994, who claimed that God told me to do it. The Gray Man. Albert Fish, known as the Gray Man, was an American serial killer, child abuser, and cannibal. Fish pleaded guilty to having abused 400 children and killed several of them. His crimes, committed in the early 20th century, were extraordinary, perverse, and sadistic. Fish preyed on young children, often torturing them before killing them. His deranged mind had developed a deep fascination with pain, both inflicting it on others and experiencing it himself. The most cruel detail of his acts was the chilling letters Fish wrote to the families of his victims, detailing the horrific acts he committed. His most infamous crime was the abduction and murder of the 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928. Fish lured her away from her family with the promise of a party, but it was later found that the poor girl was not just brutally murdered, but also eaten away by Fish himself. His twisted psychopathy was evident in his bizarre and masochistic behaviors, including inserting needles into his body. Surprisingly, Fish was a father of 6 children who he never abused or attacked, but did routinely ask them to paddle his legs with nails until blood ran down from them. Fish was eventually caught, pleaded guilty in 1935, and was sentenced to die by electrocution in 1936. The Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, was an American serial killer who assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in the 1970s. Gacy was a respected community member, often dressing up as Pogo the Clown for children's parties, which made his crimes all the more shocking. Gacy's psychotic nature was hidden behind the mask of a funny clown. He would lure his victims to his home, often with promises of offering them work, and then subject them to different types of assaults before killing them. Most of his victims were buried in the crawlspace of his house, which became a macabre graveyard later. In fact, by 1978, Gacy's graveyard had no more space left. Thus, he shifted to dumping the bodies in a nearby river, which ultimately gave the police the loophole they were desperately looking for. Gacy was initially tested and released mainly because he had maintained an image of a strong community man hosting the best parties who would never mean to harm anyone. Gacy's depravity and cruelty were evident in the methods of torture and murder he employed, reflecting a deeply disturbed mind. He was arrested in 1978 and later executed in 1994. Rure Cannibal. Joachim Kroll, nicknamed the Rure Cannibal, was a German serial killer who murdered at least 14 people, mostly young women and children between 1955 and 1976. Kroll's sadistic acts began shortly after his mother passed away and showed heavy signs of cannibalism and dark fantasies. He would often strangle his victims before mutilating their bodies and consuming their flesh. Kroll's deranged behavior included keeping body parts in his refrigerator for later consumption. Strangely, Kroll was well known and liked by the children of his own neighborhood. He would go on routine evening walks with the little girls from the neighboring houses and often buy them candy. Surprisingly, none of them were subjected to his sadistic pleasures. Kroll also used to collect dolls, on which he would rehearse the horrible acts he planned on committing with the children. Another strange twist in Kroll's story, and also the main reason why he was able to stay out of the police's grasp, was how quickly other men were convicted and sentenced for the crimes he had committed. His arrest in 1976 was as shocking as his crimes. Police found a cooking pot with parts of his last victim boiling inside. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 1991. The Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo, known as the Golden State Killer, terrorized California in the 1970s and 1980s with a series of brutal carnal abuse and murders. DeAngelo's psychopathy was hidden beneath his appearance as a former police officer and family man. He committed at least 13 murders, 50 carnal assaults, and over 100 burglaries, all while maintaining a methodical approach to his victims. DeAngelo would stalk his victims, often breaking into their homes to prepare for his attacks. His crimes were characterized by extreme violence and psychological torture, including taunting his victims and their families. The true extent of his sadist mindset was not fully revealed until his arrest in 2018. Thanks to advancements in DNA technology, DeAngelo was able to escape capture for decades while leading a seemingly normal life. However, karma has its way of getting back. Thus, in 2020, the 74-year-old father and grandfather, yet a cruel abuser, pleaded guilty to all charges of murders, assaults, and burglaries, and was charged with a life sentence with no parole. DeAngelo was given a chance to speak after the victims' families, yet all he could say was, "I am sorry," and "guilty," hoping that this would provide some closure to the families he had disoriented. Monster of the Andes. Pedro Lopez is one of the most creative serial killers in history, with a confessed victim count of over 300 young girls in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Lopez's psychopathy was rooted in a traumatic childhood filled with abuse and violence. His crimes were driven by a deep-seated hatred for women, leading him to commit horrific acts of rape and murder. Lopez would lure his victims, often from rural areas, before subjecting them to unspeakable acts of torture, such as slitting their throats. His deranged mind viewed his killings as a form of revenge against society and especially the people who had previously abused him. He was also reported to play tea parties with corpses of his victims on a routine basis. The peak of his killing speed came in 1978 when Lopez was abducting and murdering around 3 innocent girls every week. Lopez was captured in 1979 after a flash flood revealed 4 of his victims' bodies, and he was also allegedly seen trying to kidnap a 12-year-old girl. Lopez was released in 1998 in Ecuador to revive professional help. However, he managed to escape and remains unknown to date. Is he dead, or is he planning his next attack? No one knows. Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, was an American serial killer who targeted Southern California in the mid-1980s. Ramirez's crimes were one of extreme violence and sadistic rituals, which showed just how disturbed and psychotic his mind was. This disrupted mindset is likely to have stemmed from his childhood, which was influenced by his abusive father and a sick cousin who bragged about committing all kinds of crimes. Ramirez's methods were particularly brutal, involving the use of various weapons and extreme cruelty. He left satanic symbols at the crime scenes, further showing his deranged state of mind. Ramirez's reign of terror created widespread fear until his capture in 1985. His trial was streamed publicly, where he showed no remorse, famously saying, "See you in Disneyland," after his conviction. While Ramirez was sentenced to 19 death penalties, the man couldn't live long to experience the fraction of pain he caused to others and died of cancer in 2013 while on death row. Lady Bluebeard. Lady Bluebeard was a Norwegian-American serial killer who murdered her suitors and others in the early 20th century. Belle Gunness's dark mindset was masked by her seemingly benevolent nature, running a farm in Indiana where she would lure wealthy men with the promise of marriage. Once they arrived, Gunness would murder them, often dismembering their bodies and burying them on her property. Her crimes were driven by greed, as she would collect life insurance policies and other financial gains from her victims. Gunness's disturbed behavior included murdering her own children and setting her farmhouse on fire to cover up her crimes. She disappeared in 1908, and her fate remains a mystery, with some people believing she faked her death to escape capture. Throughout the years, multiple forensic reports have appeared, yet Gunness was never officially pronounced dead, and her whereabouts still remain a mystery. Green River Killer. The Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, was a haunting figure in American crime history, operating in the 1980s and 1990s around Washington state. Ridgway preyed on vulnerable women, often sex workers or runaways. His method was chillingly simple. He would lure them with promise, then strangle them and discard their bodies in remote areas near the Green River, earning his infamous nickname. What made Ridgway particularly terrifying was his ability to escape arrest for so long despite being a suspect early on. He blended into society, holding down a job and appearing innocent to those around him. He eventually confessed to 49 murders, which shocked the nation. But it wasn't until advancements in DNA technology in 2001 that Ridgway was finally convicted and brought to justice. His cooperation with authorities in locating the remains of his victims was both chilling and crucial in closing the case. Ridgway had a deep-rooted hatred for his mother and a surprisingly low IQ, both of which fueled his desire and the childhood wish to feel what it would be like to kill someone. The Beast. Luis Garavito, known as the Bestia, or the Beast, is one of the world's most terrifying serial killers, with a victim count potentially exceeding 300 young boys in Colombia. Garavito's psychopathy was rooted in a childhood of abuse and neglect, which he later inflicted on his victims in horrific ways. He would lure boys with promise of money or gifts, then subject them to prolonged torture, carnal abuse, and murder. Garavito's acts of torture included mutilating and decapitating his victims, often leaving their bodies in mass graves. Garavito was able to escape arrest for such a long period, mainly because he traveled a lot during his killing spree and committed murders in at least 11 of Colombia's apartments. Garavito was finally arrested in 1999, and his detailed confession shocked the world. He was sentenced to over 1,800 years in prison, though Colombian law limits incarceration to 40 years. His sentence remains the longest sentence in Colombia's history to date. Butcher of Rostov. Andrei Chikatilo was a Soviet serial killer who murdered at least 52 women and children between 1978 and 1990. Chikatilo's psychopathy was purely extreme sexual sadism and a deep-seated hatred for women. He would attract his victims to isolated areas where he subjected them to horrific acts of violence, including stabbing, mutilation, and cannibalism. Chikatilo's deranged behavior was driven by his inability to achieve sensual satisfaction without violence. His crimes went undetected for years, partly due to the inefficiency of the Soviet police system at the time. Chikatilo was finally captured in 1990 and confessed to his brutal crimes in graphic detail. His trial revealed the extent of his psychosis, with Chikatilo displaying bizarre behavior and a complete lack of remorse. He was executed in 1994, ending the life of one of the most monstrous serial killers in history, whose brutal acts left a lasting scar on Russian society. Which of these murders did you find most disturbing? The comment section awaits all your questions. For more interesting videos, click the subscribe button and turn on your notification bell. You don't want to miss anything. See you in the next video.